And the lesson today is going to be one that trying to deal with the questions that were asked by the apostles of Christ not too long before his death. It's really a difficult passage to deal with because of the way in which it's laid out. And it's one of those in which if you look at 10 different commentators on it, you'll get 10 different ideas about the way that it fits together. From looking at it at great length, I've come to more or less a conclusion that I hope will help to make it clear. In Matthew 24, and we'll be dealing extensively with Matthew 24 today, verse 3, as Jesus was sitting on the Mount of Olives, his disciples came to him privately and said, "Tell us, when will this happen? What will be the sign that you are coming again, and when the world will come to an end?" Actually, there are going to be three answers that are given, where you have two questions here, but there are actually going to be three answers that are given to questions that arise. So we're going to attempt to make those statements fit together. Part of what is being asked also is about when the temple was going to be destroyed. But in the fourth verse of Matthew 24, Jesus answered, "Be careful not to let anyone deceive you." And that is an important point to make any time that you are looking at anything as far as the Bible is concerned, that you need to be careful to pay attention to it and to do your best to understand it, and not to just be led aside by any kind of just ideas that are presented about it. So we need to look very carefully at the scriptures themselves. In Mark 13, verses 1 and 2, and Mark and Luke both have some information in regard to this particular section of scripture. As Jesus was going out of the temple courtyard, one of his disciples said to him, "Teacher, look at these huge stones and these beautiful buildings." Jesus said to him, "Do you see these large buildings? Not one of these stones will be left on top of another. Each one will be torn down." And as we think about this, one of the things that does take place, and there's going to be some history in this lesson, as you might anticipate. And as we consider this, though, Jesus made several comments at different times about the temple and the fact that it would be torn down. And then he made reference to it on another occasion when he was speaking of his own body and that he was going to be crucified and that he would rise again on the third day. This particular reference, though, is in reference to the actual physical structure of the temple itself and what was going to happen with it. And as we go on, we'll talk about that some more. Also in Luke 21:7, the disciples asked him, "Teacher, when will this happen? What will be the sign when all of this will occur?" And this is referring to the time when what was going to take place with the temple. Now, when we look at this and think about it, we also notice that there were only 4 of the apostles with him, apparently at this particular time, from Mark 13:3. As Jesus was sitting on the mount facing the temple buildings, Peter, James, John, and Andrew asked him privately, and that was the question they asked him, was what was going to happen with the temple, when was that going to occur? And going to the 25th verse in the same chapter, we have to move around some of this to understand how it's all fitting together. But he told them, he said, "Listen, I've told you this before it happens." So this is a prophecy that is being made, and Jesus is pointing out to him that he is telling them about these things in advance of what is going to take place. So we look at this, and from 1 John 2 and verse 18, "Children, it's the end of time. You've already heard that an Antichrist is coming. Certainly many Antichrists are already here. That's how we know that it's the end time." We've talked about this some before, and this was the year 90 that we're dealing with, a writing of the Gospel of John here, or not the Gospel, but 1 John, the letter that he wrote to Christians. So it's kind of establish a time period. part of the background that you need for this is Jerusalem was destroyed in AD 70. The war that began with the Romans actually started in the year 66. The city of Jerusalem was surrounded by the Romans for several years, and a great deal of difficulties and problems arose, and part of what Jesus has to say deals with that. But in the time and in the warnings that had been given throughout the New Testament was that there were going to be antichrists. And of course, part of the reason for dealing with this is because there is so much talk today about, from the premillennial standpoint, about the Antichrist and saying that he's going to appear in the last 3.5 weeks of the prophecy, and that there's going to be this destruction in Jerusalem and all these kind of things. And what we will find if we look at the way Jesus presented this is that he's actually talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. He's not talking about the time when the world is coming to an end. And this particular passage is in here, and the time noted because of the fact that antichrists were around almost continuously after Jesus' death. And so it was not anything new, unusual, and all for that to be taking place. So to put great emphasis on the Antichrist, we have been in the last days since about the year 90. So you hear all this talk about we're in the last days now. Yeah, we are. We've been there for 2,000 years. So nothing new surprising about that. Now Jesus told them in Matthew 24, 6 and 7, "You will hear of wars and rumors of wars. Don't be alarmed. These things must happen, but they don't mean that the end has come." And so this is an important spot to notice, because Jesus is saying, and of course a lot of what you hear today is along the lines of, we've got all these things going on in the world now, so this is an indication of the end of time. Well, Jesus is pointing this out. "Nation will fight against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. There will be famines and earthquakes in various places." Well, that's been going on since the time of Jesus. At the time that this was taking place, the Romans were at war literally with the world. They were fighting the Carthaginians in North Africa. They were fighting some of my ancestors probably, the Scotch and the Irish in England. They were fighting the Germans, and they were fighting the Gauls in France. They were in the particular area here where the Jews were, and that already were having a revolt in Jesus' time. If you recall, it refers to several of them. In fact, one of Jesus' apostles was a zealot, and the zealots were the ones, the revolutionaries against the Romans. So wars and rumors of wars is something, again, that has been around all of these years. And as we pointed out before, they claim right now that there are somewhere over 100 different areas of warfare going on in the world right now. You don't hear about it on the news because nobody cares whether they're killing some of the people in the northern or the southern part of Mexico, for instance, in the mountains. You don't really care one way or the other about that. But that's going on. So there are all kinds of these things that are happening then, that are happening now as well. And so Jesus says that's not the indicator that the end of the world has come. That's something that's going to happen, is going to continue to happen. So you can think about it from that particular standpoint. And the 8th verse tells you that all these things are only the beginning of pains of the end. In other words, these are just indications of what's taking place in the world, and all of these things are going to continue to happen. This is just part of history and what's going to take place. So we go on then to Matthew 10:21, and some more signs of the time. "Brother will hand over brother to death. A father will hand over his children. Children will rebel against their parents and kill them." So here are part of the things that are taking place. In fact, in this past week in the news, I was hearing some of these same identical things. So all of these kind of things are all indicators of the world is continuing to function much in the way that it did at Jesus' time, that these things are not new or different or unusual, and that they are not necessarily indicating that Christ is going to be here tomorrow. but they are indicators, and part of it, the reason for that is to say the Lord is coming again. And all of these things are taking place and are going to continue to happen. So you can't go based on that of trying to determine when Christ is coming back, though men try to do it all the time. In the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 7:15, beware of false prophets. They come to you disguised as sheep, but in their hearts they are vicious wolves. So people are always trying to lead people astray about when the Lord is coming. In fact, we have some religious groups that are actually the result of previous forecasts about the coming of the Lord when he didn't show up, and so they claim he came at a later time, or he came and nobody knew about it, or one thing and another. A lot of different stories that are out there in this regard. In Revelation 20 and Revelation 2:4, however, I have this against you, the love that you had at first is gone. And this was the problem at Ephesus, and it's the problem today, and it's the problem that exists in the world, is people have lost their first love. Christians, the same thing is true of them in particular. Part of the problems that exist as far as Christianity is concerned is because people have lost their first love for the Lord. They're more concerned about the material things of this life than they are about the Lord. And that, again, is nothing new. This is something that's been going on since the first century. So again, as you begin to look at all of these things and these events that are spoken of in the scriptures, you recognize that the world is functioning much the same today as it was in the times of Christ. Things were going on in those days as well. And so we don't need to think of the Jewish nation as being something that was just the only thing where anything was happening in the world at that particular time. The world, just as today, was actively involved in doing the things that people did. They were fighting and killing each other then, just like we do today. In Matthew 24:14, this good news about the kingdom will be spread throughout the world as a testimony to all the nations. Then the end will come. So this is one of the direct statements that's made about when will the end of the world come. But again, it's something that we need to recognize is not necessarily a statement about it is right now. In Romans 10:18, Paul wrote, but I ask, didn't they hear the message? Certainly they did. The voice of the messengers has gone out into the whole world, and the words to the ends of the earth. So Paul was able to write during the time of the Roman letter, which was around the year 57, that the gospel had already been taken into all the world. He makes mention of it in other places as well. So you hear arguments made that the end of the world is going to come when the gospel is taken into all the world. Well, if that's the case, then the Lord's 2,000 years late, because it's already been done. So it's continued. These things are all facts, and the fact that the Lord states that this is going to be what is going to take place is simply an indication that these are things that are going to happen. And when you see these, he's basically telling you, as he does in parables, for instance, that if you knew when someone was going to rob your house, what would you do? Would you be ready for them when they came? Of course you would. So if Jesus says, I'm going to come back on December the 14th of the year 2021, church buildings would be empty until about then, because people would say, what's the need for me to get involved, because he's not coming back till then. So the Lord did the thing that works very well with people. He just said, these are the signs, and when I come back is when my Father decides I'll come back, and nobody knows when that's going to be. So the signs have all been laid out, so it could be any time. So if you don't know when your house is going to be robbed, what do? You hire ADT or somebody like that, and you do the things that you can to protect your stuff. And so that's exactly what the Lord wants you to do. He wants you to get prepared for him when he comes back, and not wait till the day before to start getting your affairs in order. So much of in the scriptures like this is just pure common sense. And so this is what's being talked about here, though, in Matthew 24. In verses 15 and 16, we get into some more of the more difficult stuff. The prophet Daniel said that the disgusting thing that will cause destruction will stand in the holy place. When you see this, let the reader take note. Those of you in Judea should flee to the mountains. Now, this is the first indication that Christians were to take the opportunity to get out of Jerusalem. They were to avoid what is referred to in some areas as the abomination of desolation, which is the way it's spoken of in the book of Daniel. In Daniel 11:31, forces from him shall appear and profane the temple and the fortress, and shall take away the regular burnt offering, and they shall set up the abomination that makes desolate. And we go on to Daniel 12. For from the time that the regular burnt offering is taken away and the abomination that makes desolate is set up, there shall be 1290 days. Blessed are he who waits and arrives at the 1335 days. Here is where the premillennialists go wild. If you look at this, the abomination of desolation that takes place, and I have to, in this instance, go to the Apocrypha. And as you may or may not know, the Apocrypha are 13 books that were written. They're not necessarily inspired. They're basically history books that were written during the 400 years between the close of the Old Testament and the beginning of the New Testament. And during that period of time, we don't have any scripture. There's 400 years there that's just the between the testaments period. The only thing we have during that time that's of any real value is the Apocrypha, because these were books that were written by the Jews about the history of what was taking place there. And one of these individuals was Judas Maccabeus and his sons. There was a revolt during this time against the Romans and against others as well. And in this particular instance, what Maccabeus is talking about is about a man called Antiochus Epiphanes. He was from Syria. He had gone into Egypt and had taken it over, basically. And then he got word that the Jews had revolted against him. He'd already captured Palestine, and the Jews revolted against him, and so he returned with his army to Jerusalem. He gave orders that no one was to be spared. And in the day that his army returned, 40,000 Jews were killed in hand-to-hand combat. An additional 40,000 women and children were killed by his soldiers, and 80,000 more were sold into captivity or as slaves. So he took his vengeance, and then is where we get into this. And it's the 1290 days and the 1335, but I'll read you from first Maccabees 1:54. Now the 15th day of the month Caslu, in the 145th year, they set up the abomination of desolation upon the altar and builded idol altars throughout the cities of Judah on every side. What Antiochus did, he built an altar in the temple and sacrificed a hog on it. There wasn't anything that you could do from the Jewish standpoint that would desecrate the temple any more than that, to offer a sacrifice to a pagan god and use a hog to do it, which was an unclean animal. And so this was the abomination of desolation spoken of by this. And the 1290 days figures out to be roughly 3.5 years. That was how long Antiochus was in control of Jerusalem. The Maccabees revolted against him and forced him out. And about 45 days later, which was the 1335, Maccabeus died. So Daniel's prophecy is almost exact to the very number of days that was involved. But the premillennialists jump on this and they say that here is our 3.5 years from the time when the Antichrist comes into the picture and before the end of the world. And of course, you're going to continue to have that kind of thing. But Jesus' statement then to the apostles was in Luke 21:20, but when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that its desolation has come near. So when we talk about the desolation in this particular instance, if we go back to the abomination of desolation, which is also used in some passages similar to Luke 21, then you get the picture that this is a time when they are about to be invaded by an outside army, and that this is an indication that something needs to take place, and they're going to have to take some kind of activity. So now's the time when you need to get your Bibles, but you only have to open to the 24th chapter of Matthew, because that's where we're going to be. In verses, and this is a long reading from 17 through 26. Let him who is on the housetop not go down to take anything out of the house, and let him who is in the field not go back to get his clothes. But woe to those who are pregnant and to those who are nursing babies in those days. And pray that your flight may not be in the winter or on the Sabbath, for then there will be great tribulation, such as not been since the beginning of the world until this time, nor ever shall be. And unless those days were shortened, so no flesh would be saved. But for the elect's sake, those days will be shortened. Then if anyone says to you, look, here is the Christ, or there, do not be deceived by or believe it. For false Christs and false prophets will arise and show great signs and wonders to deceive, if possible, the elect. See, I have told you beforehand. So as we look at this and we think about it, these are the statements that Jesus is making about things that are going to take place. In other words, when you see this indication, and the best indication I can think of is referring to is when you see the army coming and surrounding Jerusalem, the thing to do is to get out. And this was being about in the year 66. And the Christians did. Historically, they left Jerusalem and went south into the mountains and to escape from the Romans. The destruction of Jerusalem is one of the most gruesome stories that you find in history. The city of Jerusalem was surrounded by really strong walls, and as if you read the history, you know that they had, in the past, they had cut the passageway through the rock to a spring, the spring of Kidron, that supplied water to the city so that it could stand for a long time, because in those days when you were under siege, water was one of the principal things that you needed. So Jerusalem had that. But about 1 million people were in the city of Jerusalem, and they ran out of food. The Romans built an earthwork wall around the city, and there have been several reports made, and one of them was that the Romans withdrew for some reason, and during that time the Christians escaped, and that may or may not be so. Could be. We do know that some of the Jews escaped, and they went to a place called Masada, which was a mountain not too far away, and it was a fortification that was there, and I'm not going to go into that part of it. But the reality is that that opportunity presented itself. The Christians recognized it was time to go, and the story that Jesus gives here, the information he gives is, when the time comes to leave, don't go back. Don't even go in to get anything. You leave with the clothes on your back. If you're in the field, you don't go back home. If you're in town, you just leave. You get out. Get out while you can, because this abomination is going to take place. Some contend it was the abomination of the Romans taking their shields and putting them in the temple. That wouldn't work, because the reality is that the destruction would already be underway. So in the reality, Christians got out ahead of time, and then the Romans destroyed the city. But to say what took place, you can imagine, and I'm just part of it. They ran out of food in Jerusalem. People died. They stored them in buildings and put guards on them, because that was the only way they could ensure the bodies wouldn't be stolen. Eventually, they surrendered, and the Romans destroyed the city. And the destruction that was spoken of, Jesus said, when the temple would be taken down, one not stone left upon another. The Romans burned the temple, and the gold that was on the walls, the gold leaf and all that was on the walls of the temple, went down between the stones of the foundation, and the Roman soldiers literally pried the temple stones apart to get the gold. So Jesus' prophecy was exact. Not one stone was left on another. The temple was totally destroyed, never rebuilt. And for a long time, about the only inhabitants of the city of Jerusalem was the 10th Roman Legion. Virtually everybody was gone. It was deserted. It was just a desolate ruin. That's all it was. And so this was, of course, what Jesus had prophesied and said would take place. Now we go to Matthew 24, verses 27 through 33. For as the lightning comes from the east and flashes to the west, so also will the coming of the Son of Man be. For wherever the carcass of there, the eagles will be gathered together, and that's a bad translation. It should be buzzards. Immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not leave its light. Stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. Then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in heaven, and then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And he will send his angels, and a great sound of a trumpet, and they will gather together his elect from the four winds, from the end of heaven to the other. Now hear this parable from the fig tree. When its branches have already become tender and puts forth leaves, you will know summer is near. So you also, when you see all these things, know that it is near the doors. So what this is basically saying, and this is where the real difficulty arises, because it would be apparent that this last reading that we have is talking about actually the return of Christ. And while it appears in this particular location is kind of a mystery, and no one really understands exactly why it is. And so the end result is that the majority of people commenting about it say that the whole story has been about Jerusalem, and all of that has been an indication of the end of the world. And that is why, if you're looking at television, you will see when someone predicts the end of the world, they immediately set their cameras up looking on the city of Jerusalem, because the belief is that you're going to see Jerusalem destroyed. And that's going to be part of the battle of Armageddon that's spoken of by the premillennialists. That's going to have to take place when Jerusalem is going to be destroyed. And part of the addition to that, of course, what has to take place first is, in order to fulfill the prophecies of Daniel, the temple has to be rebuilt. Jews have to begin worshiping there again, so that the abomination can take place, because you can't have an abomination of the temple if there's no temple. So the temple's got to be rebuilt, and as a result of that, it has to be during the time of the Roman of Rome. Well, there is no Roman Empire, so the Roman Empire has become the European Union is now considered to be the Roman Empire to fulfill the prophecy of Daniel. Of course, the reality is Daniel's prophecy has already been fulfilled. Christ came during